Establishing central pawn presence immediately opens up avenues for development and potential queenside expansion. Immediately challenging the center, black establishes symmetry and opens lines for their queen and bishop. Developing the knight opens lines for the queen and bishop, contesting central space while preparing castling. Developing a knight symmetrically to challenge the center and prepare for pawn advances. Opening the diagonal to g5 prepares for pressure, while contesting black's central pawn. Challenging white's central grip immediately, black initiates active piece play and seeks to destabilize the d4 pawn. Capturing the pawn is a tempting but potentially risky decision, inviting black to centralize their pieces with increased influence. This check forces white to address an immediate tactical issue, potentially disrupting their development and creating an opportunity for black to regain material advantage. Forcing the queen to a less active square, this move aims to reposition the queen and prepare for future development while maintaining queenside pressure. Recapturing the pawn with the queen initiates a dynamic queen trade possibility, potentially simplifying the position while maintaining material equality. Challenging black's queen directly forces a reevaluation of its position. Consolidating the pawn deficit while preparing development, this move shores up the center and opens diagonals for the queen and bishop. Trading queens simplifies the position, potentially favoring black's slightly more active piece placement. Recapturing the bishop tidies up the queenside pawns and prepares to challenge white's central space. Solidifying the center, this pawn advance prepares for a smooth development and avoids any immediate tactical skirmishes. Developing the knight to c6 solidifies black's central presence and prepares to castle, building a harmonious defensive structure. Reinforcing the pawn chain solidifies white's central grip and prepares for future queenside expansion. Safeguarding the monarch into the corner initiates a phase of solidifying the position. Preventing nb4 ideas and preparing g4 offers a subtle grip on space. Repositioning the rook to the e-file prepares for potential central pawn advances and offers flexibility for future maneuvers. Asserting pressure on the queen side, the bishop targets potential weaknesses and influences key squares. Anchoring the bishop here prepares to challenge white's central pawn structure and reactivate pieces. Castling secures the king and prepares to activate the rook, a crucial step in developing the queen side. Challenging the bishop's influence, this pawn advance disrupts white's development and opens a diagonal for black's queenside pieces to become more active. Sacrificing the bishop to clarify the pawn structure, opening lines for potential piece activity down the open files. Reclaiming the piece with the bishop creates a symmetrical pawn structure, solidifying black's central control and preparing for potential queenside expansion. Developing the knight to its natural outpost reinforces control over central squares and prepares for future pawn pushes, aiming for a more active piece deployment. Asserting central pressure, black repositions their rook to control an open file, preparing for future skirmishes. Repositioning the knight to the queenside aims to pressure black's center pawns. Consolidating the bishop back to a more secure square, this move anticipates future pawn advances while preparing the knight to join the central struggle. Securing the d-file signals white's intention to improve piece activity and contest central influence. A daring infiltration, this knight aims to disrupt white's central control and seize active squares. Targeting the weak a6 pawn, this knight jump now pressures black's queenside pawns and creates potential for a fork. Targeting the knight on a5 with the bishop creates a dynamic positional exchange and aims to disrupt white's knight coordination. Asserting control over the central files, this rook's maneuver prepares for a potential exchange or a strong central pawn push. Preparing to shift the bishop, the knight on a5 is now less of a nuisance as the queen's flank solidifies. Consolidating the rook's defense of the central pawn structure becomes paramount. Redirecting the knight to a more active central outpost significantly enhances black's piece coordination and challenges white's pawn structure. Repositioning the knight to a central outpost initiates a fierce battle for control of key squares. Challenging the knight's comfortable square, this bishop subtly probes for a queenside advantage. Consolidating forces to potentially exploit weaknesses on the queenside after black's passive development. The knight retreats, seeking to redeploy and exploit the open diagonals, potentially targeting weak pawns or initiating a kingside attack. Repositioning the knight, white seeks to break free from the pin and potentially attack the queenside pawn structure. This pawn advances, creating a new outpost for the knight and challenging white's knight on a5. Exchanging this knight simplifies the position, aiming to exploit black's slightly exposed queen's bishop. This capture opens diagonals for your bishops and loosens white's pawn structure on the queenside. The knight retreats, repositioning to prepare a bolder sortie. Challenging white's knight's outpost, black establishes a commanding pawn chain, restricting enemy mobility and gaining crucial central space. The knight hops back, a cautious maneuver to regroup and defend the weakened queenside pawns from further encroachment. Repositioning the rook to pressure the queenside pawn structure offers new avenues for attack. Asserting dominion over the open c-file promises to unravel black's pawn structure. Shifting the rook to the b-file aims to challenge white's control over that crucial open file, potentially creating counterplay and preventing further pawn advances. Undermining the central pawn chain aims to liberate the knight to a more active square. Exposing the queen and pawn structure by grabbing the b3 pawn opens critical diagonals for the rooks and creates lasting weaknesses. Opening the file creates pressure on black's queenside pawns. Repositioning the bishop to activate it on the queenside diagonal and challenge white's central pawn structure. Opening the file prepares a potential assault on black's vulnerable kingside pawns. Probing for weaknesses, this pawn advance aims to dislodge the knight and gain space on the kingside. Opening the g-file aims to disrupt black's king safety. The rook's excursion to c3 opens tactical lines, but leaves the queen's side structure vulnerable to a counterattack. Clearing the d-file opens avenues for rapid deployment of your remaining troops. Seizing the open file with the bishop dramatically alters the queenside initiative. Redirecting the knight to a more active square is a sound positional adjustment, eyeing potential weaknesses in black's pawn structure. Repositioning the bishop to f6 seeks to increase pressure on the central pawn mass and prepare for potential piece exchanges that could open up lines. Consolidating the rook's pressure on the c-file solidifies white's central ambitions. Securing the king on its current square is a prudent defensive measure, but it doesn't address the underlying positional weaknesses. Securing the open file with the rook profoundly restricts black's queenside mobility. Reinforcing the king's shelter against potential pawn advances on the kingside. A timely advance, this pawn push aims to disrupt black's tightly packed queenside pawns and potentially open the b-file for your rooks. Opening a path for the bishop to influence the queenside pawn structure feels passive. Asserting dominion over the queenside, the bishop seeks to disrupt black's coordination, creating imbalances. A strategic repositioning, preparing to contest the central files once the bishop finds a more active square. Unleashing the rook to the 8th rank seizes an open highway and pressures black's defense from an unexpected angle. Trading off black's active bishop simplifies the position, but opens a diagonal for white's rook. Capturing the pawn opens a critical pathway for the rook to infiltrate black's territory. Seizing the open c-file offers crucial counterplay and aims to pressure white's isolated pawn. Seizing the open file, white aims to exploit black's disconnected pawns and advance their own decisive queen's side majority. Initiating a critical pawn advance to seize central influence and disrupt the opponent's pawn structure. Asserting the rook's presence on the 7th rank now creates a crucial bind, restricting black's bishop. The bishop repositions, anticipating a potential advance of the white rook. Activating the knight towards the enemy king creates significant pressure and potential mating threats. a desperate check forcing material concessions, or a king escape route, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure. Aimed at evading the immediate discovered attack, this king repositioning seeks to enhance its defensive posture, preparing for potential future skirmishes. A quiet repositioning of the rook, now eyeing the open c-file and potentially supporting an advance on the queen side. The king boldly ventures forward, seeking active participation and potential counterplay in the simplified middle game. Probing the king's defenses, black's pawn thrusts toward the corner initiate a desperate gambit for counterplay. Opening the kingside diagonal, this bold pawn push seeks to disrupt black's defensive pawn structure and potentially expose the monarch. A desperate attempt to escape the white king's tightening net, though the material deficit likely seals black's fate. Knight repositioning aims to defend the king and prepare for potential pawn breaks. Challenging the knight's outposts, this pawn advance opens critical lines for future counterplay. Disrupting the pawn chain's integrity and threatening the king's safety. Challenging the open file is a bold attempt to disrupt white's coordinated attack. Securing the 7th rank allows white to prevent black's rook from activating further down the board. Opening the center with this pawn thrust aims to activate the king and potentially disrupt white's rook on the 7th rank. Unleashing the e-pawn creates immediate chaos and aims to destabilize black's king. Unleashing the pawn chain, black aims to disrupt white's regal security. Recapturing the pawn reignites central control, forcing black to address the imminent king's safety threat. King ventures forward, seeking activity, but exposes itself to white's unleashed pawn storm on the kingside. Activating the rook to infiltrate black's territory and harass the king. Relocating the bishop seeks to activate its diagonal influence and potentially support pawn pushes later. Forcing the black king to reveal its position with this aggressive check is a smart tactical choice. The pawn structure is a mess, and this retreat only makes defending the 7th rank more difficult. Shifting the king to a safer square on the kingside, away from any potential discovered attacks. Seeking to activate the king and potentially create counterplay, but it might be exposing itself too much in this sharp middle game. Reinforcing the knight's central outpost now aims to solidify control of key squares. Repositioning the rook to the file now aims to create a passed pawn or pressure the white king's defenses. Initiating a decisive rook maneuver to reclaim control of the critical 7th rank. King's desperate scramble for safety is momentarily disrupted by a timely check. Seeking to secure the king, white retreats it to a safer square, anticipating further complications. Focusing the bishop on the king's vicinity creates immediate tactical threats. Activating the knight to pressure the central pawn chain, aiming to disrupt black's defense. Shifting the bishop to the queen's flank hopes to find activity, but it may become a target on the edge. Securing the central dark squares with the rook offers a strategic repositioning, ready to contest key lines. Seeking to disrupt white's rook lift and create counterplay, black aims to activate their own rook on a more dynamic file. Securing the rook's long-term presence on the 7th rank solidifies control and prepares for potential pressure on the king. Aggressively shifting the king towards the center could invite tactical fireworks given white's active pieces. Securing the d-file is paramount for consolidating the material advantage and preparing a decisive assault. Seeking to activate the rook and menace the white king with coordinated threats. Initiating a regrouping to reinforce the central control and prepare for further pawn advancements. Opening the center with d4 injects dynamic possibilities, potentially unlocking sacrifices or creating new avenues for the black king's defense. Shifting the knight to its own ranks, white seeks to avoid the discovered attack and prepare for a potential pawn push, though it concedes some central influence. This pawn advance desperately seeks to open lines for the bishop and exploit white's slightly misplaced knight. Shifting the rook to the d-file aims to contest control and potentially create breakthroughs for the remaining pieces.